Hey everybody, welcome to Bible Study That Doesn't Suck. This is Pastor Megan at Grace Lutheran in San Francisco. Looks like I'm the only one, at least so far. Happy Pentecost 8B. Woo! Only church geeks will know what that actually means. Just the 3-year rotation of Bible readings we're on. Today's, Sunday's readings are primarily focused on sheep texts and about how God is like a shepherd. The thing to know before we start is that sheep are some of the least intelligent animals, and so being compared to a sheep is not nice. It's not nice. It's not something that we would want God to think of us as. Except that the good news is that if God thinks of us as sheep, whenever we screw up, God is not surprised. Right? And so God is not someone who expects us to be perfect. This story in the Bible is not one that expects us to be perfect, because it is one that thinks that we are as wayward as sheep. Sheep will follow the sound of the voice. You might have remembered some of the Bible stories about the lost sheep who gets lost. I'll put a whole bunch of links to ways that sheep have been used in ancient mythology or faith stories, depending upon your perspective of these different cultures and their faith beliefs. You can decide what to call those different groups, but there's lots of stories about how sheep were thought of in ye olden times. Sound pretty good? All right, let's look at some of the text that are on here. Let's see. So I'm going to skip 2 Samuel because 2 Samuel is not interesting to me. And it's not about sheep, and today we're going to talk about sheep. So if you're a pastor who's going to talk about 2 Samuel, good for you. But we're going to start with Jeremiah 23, 1 through 6. It's an interesting story. It's talking a couple of things that might stick out to you. One is this idea of the sheep getting scattered. God finding a way to say, when you hurt my people, I'm going to get revenge, but not like that, right? That I am going to bring you people who are going to bring leadership that are going to help you sort through this mess. If there are particular saints or civil rights leaders that have meant a lot to you, you can imagine God saying, I'm going to send you some civil rights leaders who are going to lead you out of the way of this corrupt nation. So it could be akin to saying Martin Luther King Jr. is going to come and show you the way through this mess, and then you're going to have to deal with civil rights. In the historical perspective, we have a little... I brought this along because I had a feeling we'd be missing the geeky pastors who typically join us. We have a lot of our joining pastors are away on vacation during the summertime. So I have brought you some insights from a book called Feasting on the Word, Preaching the Revised Common Lectionary. If you want to look it up, I'll put a copy of the book down here. Otherwise, I'll just tell you some of the ideas. It's kind of a cheat sheet for knowing some of the historical information that's behind the Bible verses. I'm telling you the book that I'm getting this from because I don't want you to think that every pastor is like smart in all of these history ways. We have to look it up too. And I think that's a great thing. So there we go. And in this section on Jeremiah, which is written by Karen Sapio, there is a conversation about what historically is going on in these texts. So particularly, these texts are talking about the kings that are going to come and be the kings who rule in Israel. Remember, in the story in the Bible, there's this idea that during their time in Exodus, the people got really... They didn't like the voice of God. When they heard the voice of God, it scared the bejesus out of them. And they didn't necessarily like what God was saying. And God was, kind of bossy and had a bunch of rules. If you want to learn more about that, you can check out Barbara Brown Taylor's book, When God is Silent, to see why people said, hey, God, stop talking to us. I couldn't imagine it now because we really want God to talk to us. But back then, they were like, God, stop talking to us. We want kings instead. We want human leaders who are going to help us know what to do, help us get through this life, and who are going to organize our world and be just. So we want you to bring kings. So at this time in history that Jeremiah is writing, there are two kings, and people don't know which king is the rightful king. And in the Hebrew, there's a lot of conversation about wordplay going on, that the word for rightful and righteous, so the person who's the next in line, or the person who's the right king, or the person who's the best king, like according to God's idea, the righteous king, it's the exact same word. And so there's a little bit of wordplay going on. We can imagine that this is like the time when Al Gore and George Bush had to get the election decided by the Supreme Court. And so the answer of who was righteous and who was the rightful president might have gotten answered in two different ways if you disagreed with the way the Supreme Court came down. And for some people, the righteous and rightful were the exact same. And for other people, neither the righteous nor the rightful got taken care of. And so that's the kind of argument that's happening in this place. It's a hanging Chad kind of conversation, trying to figure out what God is up to during this time when we don't know who the right king or the righteous king is, and how God is going to pay a visit to the shepherds who have failed to do what they're supposed to. So is there punishment for people who aren't caring for us in the way that we ought to be cared for? And we all might have experiences of that if we've ever dated or had parents that disappointed us ever in our lives. So in this text is this idea that the people be fruitful and multiply. This is something that is echoing from Genesis and comes out of the idea that the Jewish people are being destroyed, they're being slaughtered, and that part of their ability to survive, part of their ability to exist in the world comes from making new people, right? So it has a sexual connotation. Later in some of Paul's writing, this idea of being fruitful will be transformed in parables about bearing good fruit and about, wine branches, vines and branches, and whose fruit. And it sounds like being fruitful and multiplying is about growing and evangelizing. Being fruitful and multiplying can be about being our best, juiciest, most fabulous selves. Here in the context of this text in Jeremiah, it's talking about the exile. There were these people who were captured in the Babylonian exile. And so some of the people in this prisoner of war camp had to figure out how to be faithful. When were the times that they compromised, that they became like Babylonian culture? And when were the times when they refused to assimilate and be like Babylonian culture? And all of those choices, some people think you're right doing this, some people think you're right doing that, some people think don't assimilate at all. It's a conversation we still have today. Do we have to follow the Bible exactly as they followed it back when they were in exile, or back when they were on the mountain in Egypt? Or do we need to be a part of the culture that we're living in now? Can we use cell phones? Can we do Bible study on Google Hangout? What? YouTube, right? So there's this question that's been going through all of history and all of faithful people, wondering how much can they assimilate? How much should they not assimilate? So there were these people in these POW camps in exile who were figuring out how to live in faith together. And the people who were captured, you can imagine, were like the best and the brightest and the leaders. So they all were trying to work this out and figure it out over here. And then back in regular society, the people who hadn't been taken away and separated from the others were living as they were, right? And they were continuing all of the same rituals. And so you had some people who had incorporated some of the cultures of Babylon, and some of the people who had not and were moving forward. And then when they come back together, they got to figure out, how do they do church? How do they do life? How do they live together? And so a lot of the Hebrew Bible is working out how they're going to do that. And strangely, a lot of what's happening in churches is working that out, right? The people who want to have church like it was in the 50s because it was the amazingest, bestest, most choiriest church they ever had. I made up a bunch of words. It's okay. Right? The people who say, we did it this way, it worked, we got to keep doing it that way, are as right as the people who are saying we need to incorporate the new things that speak to a new generation, and this struggle of how do we have church together, loving those who are a part of the culture and loving those who are holding on to the cultures that have nurtured them from the past. How do we do it without making anyone mad, without anyone feeling like God's only with us and not with you? Unfortunately, aside from the metaphor of a shepherd coming and helping us sort it all out sometime in the future that never actually existed tangibly in the world, where they're like, aha, we did it, write it down, become a New York Times bestseller, because now we know how to merge two different groups and be a loving church faithful group. Wouldn't that have been great? Someone should have wrote it down, even just that one moment. So Jeremiah is being upset that there's two different kings, that they're not doing what he would want them to do. He's trying to figure out what's going on and how to merge these different societies together. And he's trying to argue that when everything is hopeless, when everything points to defeat and destruction and dynastic failure and exile, that God's intention is for faithfulness and to covenant to us and for the salvation of people. And if you've been following, I've been doing a new thing lately called Daily Grace, where every day I post something that is trying to point us towards hopefulness in the midst of a world where the news bombards us with everything the opposite of hopefulness for the most part. So know that desire to weed through all of the bleh of the world, the BS of the world, and find what God is up to, and to find those moments of positivity, those spark, and the ways that we can view ourselves with love is a way of continuing this story in Jeremiah. And stay tuned, because Jeremiah, if you were reading it from the beginning, I wish maybe I'll switch to the narrative lectionary with my congregation at some point so we can read through the whole thing. Jeremiah's got some saucy ways of talking about how the world's going to work. Like, he might be talking about sheep metaphors in this one, but later he's going to talk about underwear metaphors, that we're God's dirty underwear. I'm serious. Jeremiah's got some amazing metaphors going on. All right, so we also got Psalm 23. Some people love Psalm 23. If you haven't heard Bobby McFerrin's version of Psalm 23, I'll post it down here. Let me write a note to remember that. Okay, I'm going to remember that. Harder to write it down when no one else is talking, though, right? Psalm 23, a lot of people like this at funerals. A lot of people feel sad when they hear Psalm 23 because it's at funerals. A couple things to notice in the words of the text is that God, the intent, at least in Psalm 23, is that God is making us people who lack for nothing. Although the text doesn't say what the object of lack is, whatever it is, God is a shepherd, and the absence of lack is what you get by hanging out with this shepherd. Some people have taken this to think about something called prosperity gospel. And I'm writing it down, so I'll put a link down here. Prosperity gospel is the idea, if you've ever heard of anyone named like Joel Osteen, it's people who think if you pray hard enough and long enough, you will become wealthy. That God desires you to become wealthy. And there are points in the Bible where you can find this theology that if you pray, you can have anything you want. You can be rid of any disease. You'll have all the money you want. Everything amazing will happen to you. The difficulty comes when we pray with all of our might and we're not rich. or when it's only rich people telling us how great they are because they're rich, and that means that God must be with them. That feels yucky, right? For the most part, God, and in the stories of our Bible, in our scripture, God is with people who are poor. God is with tax collectors who are hated. God is with the widow who has lost all of her coins. God is telling stories of people who are being conquered and who the only thing they have is their kids, or they're homeless and roaming around from place to place, or they are the ones that are perceived to be not the smartest, not the brightest, not the fastest, whatever things you could be teased about in high school. The characters in this Bible are all of those things that it would be awkward to be in high school. And God is with us and God is for us. And so how do we reconcile this idea, this hope beyond hope, that God will provide us with all of our needs, that God will end hunger? And one of the ways that people have done this is that they talk about timing. And the fancy word for this is eschatology, and it means end times. And so there's this idea that in the end, we're going to get what we deserve. We're not going to maybe see it while we're alive. We're not maybe going to have that justice from the political leaders of our day. But in the end, all will be righted, and we will finally get what we deserve. And so some of the people in the Bible are saying this justice that proves that God is God and we are not is going to come in a time that is following God's timing and not necessarily our, can I have it right now, please, timing. If you've ever had someone say to you something like, this is God's will, when something really crappy has happened and you're like, back at them because you think God is a loving God who names and claims you and doesn't want bad things to happen to you and doesn't celebrate in the worst days, then it can be really frustrating to hear because they're thinking about end times, and in the end time, everything's going to be fine. And in our deep sadness, in depression, in the midst of heartache and heartbreak, we sometimes don't give crap about what's going to happen in the end times. We want comfort now, and we want people to listen to what stinks and to sit with us and not try to provide answers to make it better. So if the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. If this Psalm 23 is something that soothes your soul, then read it, pray it, love it. If it's not, wait till a different point in your life until you can. And maybe it will feel soothing as time moves, because none of us are stuck. Always things are changing, even if it's the tiniest bit of something getting better, even if it's our tolerance getting stronger to be able to live with something that's really hard. Things change. Sometimes they change for the worse. That's true. But I think that God's always with us. God has been to the deepest of deep despair, and God can travel with us in our deepest journey towards deep despair, even if it doesn't have a cure, even if it's chronic, right? God can be in our chronic, unhealable stuff too. Because otherwise, people who are living with stuff that's not curable, people who are going to have addiction their whole lives, people who are going to say the wrong thing at parties, people who are going to feel guilty because they're not living up to the to-do list that they think they can live up to, are never going to feel like God is with them and for them. And it's bananas. It's bananas because if we were perfect, if we could figure it out on our own, if we had an attention span long enough to remember that God was with us and for us all the time, we wouldn't need grace. We wouldn't need big grace, and we wouldn't need flashy Jesus on a cross. He wasn't really flashy. But you know what I'm saying? Like, God wouldn't have to go to such great lengths to be with us and to save us and to try to pull us towards that arc that bends towards justice if we could do it on our own. And if simply praying about it was enough to make the world better, why, oh why, would Jesus need to die on a cross? Because couldn't we all just pray? Just saying. So that's a little bit of what Ephesians is talking about. The Ephesians reading is talking about getting rid of this separation. So there was this idea that there were some people who were really good at being churchy, at being faithful, who were good at praying, and this separation happened in a really tangible way in Israel. And it's the temple wall. And the temple wall had a sign on it, and it said Gentiles, or people who aren't following the prayers in the right order, who aren't following the Torah, the rule book of how to be faithful, whether it's about circumcision or following the Sabbath or any of the ritual cleaning laws, people who are Gentiles and are not following all of these faithful rules, or just have had bad luck, right? Because there were some rules about who could enter the temple based on, like, if you had acne or your menstruation or different things going on in your life that might or might not have been curable at the time. And so the Ephesians text is alluding to this wall that says, if you're not good enough, you're not smart enough. It says it nicer, right? The idea is really like, this is a house of worship. So if you are someone who worships like us, come on in. If you're not, unfortunately, the sign says, we're going to put you to death. I have to say it in a funny voice because it's not funny. So there's this idea in Ephesians that this wall that separates, the wall that says you are the faithful people who know how to pray the prayers correctly. You are the ones who know the times of days when God wants you to show up and to not work or to work. And that this wall no longer will be a dividing line that separates God's people from not God's people. And not only is this written after the temple has already fallen down, so it's not like a predictor, like God's really pissed, so God's going to destroy the temple because God doesn't like Jewish people. No, this is not anti-Semitism. This is Jewish people writing this story, or maybe not, right? Depending upon who is the historical person. We don't know exactly who that person was. But these are people who have a deep respect for Jewish faith, who are writing to welcome a new group of people. Remember, we talked about the people who are always following the rules as you should, and then the people who are bringing in people who have a different understanding of what rules and culture are like and trying to merge them together. This is another one of those texts. How do we merge people together? How do we get people on the same page? How do we not just fight all the time? And so it's a text about taking down the wall, the literal wall of the temple, and saying everyone can be a part of God's people. There's no more not God's people and only God's people. Everybody's God's people. We got to learn how to play and how to get along. And part of what is talked about in this text is that the way this happens is that instead of the temple being this one fixed spot in Jerusalem, the temple becomes us, right? That if you've ever heard the idea that your body is a temple, right? This idea that we are all, through our lives, building a house for God, right? And you can think about the different ways the house of God has transformed. And one of the ways that the house of God was transformed is they used to believe that there was a dome. God lived right above the dome, and you could climb up with a ladder and you could get God. And then later they believed that Ezekiel saw this vision of God in a movable chair with fire that could get away from people who were trying to play king of the hill with God. Then they later believed kind of in this idea of this Ark of this covenant. You could carry God around and the spirit of the holiest of holies in a box and march it to a different place. Other people believed that you could build a temple, and in that place God could come and live and dwell with you. Then others entirely believed that God could become known in the hospitality and the being together. And this metaphor in Ephesians is the idea that you can build build of yourself a metaphorical building that starts with the foundations being prophets and then the apostles. And then instead of the cornerstone or the base being Jesus, as is talked about in some of the text, this text talks about Christ being the center of the archway, right? So Jesus is like the show-off stone, the like, woohoo, come on in. I don't know what that means. I don't know if I agree with the metaphor. We can talk about the different supplies and the different ways that we would build a house if God's house was what we were up to. But that's what we're up to. Hold on one sec. I'm going to text Amanda, who's wondering if we're doing Bible study. Yes, Amanda, we're doing Bible study right now. So, Mark, you know that I love the Gospel of Mark. Gospel of Mark. So this text is an interesting one. And what is frustrating about it, we were talking about this at Bible study, is that it's Mark chapter 6, but it cuts out the good parts of the story. So back in the olden times, a bunch of mostly white guys, men, who were pastors, thought, let's figure out a way that we can preach the same stuff on the same days. And they came up with a cycle of readings that lasts 3 years. And this cycle of readings is interestingly kind of cut and pasted around different texts that they think kind of go together. And some of them kind of are like a slow pitch of a like, hey, preach about this. And sometimes it seems obvious. This one about sheep seems to kind of all be put together, but it's interesting. And below in the text, you'll see that I have included some words in italics. When I put the italics in the text, it means that the way that the verses were cut and paste cuts out chunks in the middle. And I include them below. The italics are the part that won't get read aloud on a Sunday if you find yourself inside of a church space. And it's just a way to read between the lines of the parts that got taken out. And in Sunday's reading from Mark, it's a very interesting thing because they cut out the most interesting parts of the story. So this is a time when the apostles are coming back. Jesus sent them out and said, go practice telling people the good news, because when I die, you're going to need to do this. And let's like practice. It's like when teachers go through their year of internship and they practice teaching. And so Jesus kind of has them do their practice teaching and then they come back. But what's interesting is there's like this one little paragraph about them coming back, and then they kind of seem to get it. But the part that gets cut out is that they so super do not get it, because they come back and they're like, yay, we like talk to these people. And Jesus sees this huge group of people come and sees that they look like sheep without a shepherd, like ding, 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 there's the sheep verse. So now we can include this in the text. But what it skips is the part where the disciples don't know how to feed people. So it cuts out the feeding of like 5,000 people, and the disciples being like, oh, but we didn't know we could feed all these people. And then they go across to the other side, and another big group of people come and they want to be healed by touching Jesus. And so it's a very bizarre cropping of the Mark text in the way that it is cut about. Hey, it's Pastor Amanda. Sorry that we missed you earlier, Pastor Amanda.
Well, I am too. My phone and my everything did not tell me that I was being paged.
Wah, wah, sorry.
Technology didn't work for me today.
I know, and I just made the assumption that it was summer and everyone was playing hooky. See what happens? We've done a lot of talking about sheep. We've done a lot of talking about how these texts are ways of talking about how when a group of people is like, we like these rules, we like this way of worshiping God, we like our prayers, and then there's another group of people who's like, we like some of the things society is up to, and we like to do prayers and faith this way, let's try something new. And both are like, let's have church together. Wah, wah. And it's difficult. So we've been talking about that through most of the texts and ways to like make that happen. Now we're on the Mark text and we're talking about how strangely it is cut and paste.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
it seems like it's cut and paste this way just to get to the like sheep sentence. And then it can be like, oh, look, we talked about sheep again. All these texts totally go together.
Totally. And so that they can use the Johannine version of the feeding of the 5,000 next week. Meh.
Johannine? What was that word?
Johannine.
What's that
John.
mean? Oh,
The
John.
Gospel of John.
Oh, I thought you were talking about someone named Joe. And I was like, who's some guy named Joe?
No. Johnnine.
I've been using this book. We had a lovely person donate a progressive library to Grace this last week. Thank you, person. And it's been very lovely. And since all of the like geeky things about Bible history were gone, we've been using the Feast on the Word with Barbara Brown Taylor to do some of the exegesis in the back. One of the cool things that's talked about in here that I did not know before is particularly that what old-timey people would have known about the town of Gennesaret. Gennesaret. We can pronounce it whatever way we want to because we don't know. Is that because of where it was located on the western shore of Galilee between Magdala and Capernaum, and I traveled this area, that what people would have known as that this is a place of hot mineral springs where people who were sick came. The thing that we were told on our tour is also very near the hill that is the center of Kabbalism. So it's a place in Israel particularly known for healings. So these people might have been there for healings, and Jesus just might have happened to show up in the place where healings happen. And so, of course, everyone was wanting healing. They might or might not have been there for Jesus. They might have been there for healings because that's the place where you go for healings. And that what they thought was really interesting in this section of the text is that Jesus is not telling them anything. There's no mention in this story where the people are healed, where Jesus says, now memorize this gospel verse or you're not a good person. And there's nothing that says, have faith and you will be healed. And there's nothing that says anything other than they reached out and touched a tassel and then healing happened. And so there's no mention of lectures, no mention of right ways to do things, just that Jesus was a healer and healing happened for those who longed for it, which is kind of fun.
I agree.
Yeah.
I think one of the pieces that was picked up a lot in my text study yesterday was the compassion that Christ had for the gathered crowds, and that the model for leadership and the model for leadership, I'll say, that is offered in this is not that Jesus sees a crowd of people and thinks, wow, what can I get out of them? Can I get, with this amount of people, if I can get them to really appreciate me, then I'm going to have this X amount of power. So I'm going to use their need and fulfill their needs in order to gain such and such a power situation. Instead, what the gospel is very specific on is Jesus sees the crowd and sees them as someone without a leader. And not that he's like, sweet, I just got myself followers, but Jesus has compassion for them and pities them and steps
What's the Greek word for that?
I don't know that off the top of my head in the morning.
Splanchnizomai.
Splanchnizomai, is that the compassion?
Nope, it doesn't mean compassion at all, but it's what it says in the English version of the Bible.
Ooh, so what does it say?
Splanchnizomai is the literal turning of your bowels. It's the same thing that happens when someone is smelly, right? Splanchnizomai is when you have a big feeling. So it could be that Jesus vomited, or that Jesus was nervous. Have you ever had a moment when you feel something deep in your gut?
Yep.
And sometimes you might have had something deep in your gut that's like, I love these people and I feel it so deeply, right? Oftentimes, people who preach will get this feeling deep in their gut. Some people can't eat at all before they preach a sermon because the Holy Spirit comes through splanchnizomai. And it's not the same feeling, I don't think, as like stage fright, but it's this weird thing that happens to your stomach that is unexplainable. It doesn't mean compassion, though. But we want it to mean compassion because we want Jesus to be nice and to be lovely. It could mean that Jesus is judgmental. It could mean that Jesus is annoyed that he has work to do. It could mean that Jesus, I mean, it could mean that Jesus has like a teary-eyed, oh, I feel so connected to these people. Most likely it's from a more sarcastic, grumpy place.
Well, I don't
know. With a word like splanchnizomai.
Yeah, but I'm not necessarily, I don't know that I totally agree with you on that. I think that it can also be in the midst of exhaustion and in the midst of, running around so much that you don't even have time to eat, which is part of our gospel as well. There is also the point where you see a situation of people who are in desperate need and you are tired and you're annoyed and you don't necessarily want to keep going. But in your gut, you know that these people need what it is that you have to offer.
Yeah.
And not in a, yay, I'm going to get something out of this kind of a way, but in a, I have to do this because this is the right thing to be doing kind of a way. And I think that can be compassion. And not like compassion doesn't have to be fuzzy, soft. Compassion can be the same as like righteous calling into task. It can be the same as I'm going to hold you deeply and woefully accountable to your choices because I have compassion for the fact that your life is going down a road that is unhealthy and unwise. So I think that you can have all of those things and still see that it comes from a place of positive intent for other.
Sure.
The building up of other, whether it's done with bitterness and frustration, or whether it's done with great gentility and a lovely cinematic tear down the face. I think that saying that this is something where Jesus sees this group of people, knows that they are in need, knows that they need something that he specifically has to offer. And as tired as he is, he knows that he has to step forward into that, which is, we can assume that like any other human, knowing that Jesus was fully divine and fully human, that he would do so with some exhaustion. But I don't know that we want to say that he was bitter, angry, or any of those things. I don't know that I want to go there.
Well, his bowels are agitated.
And you can get that when you get butterflies when you see the person that you have a crush on. So saying bowels are agitated, I think, is a very powerful phrase because that happens when we're feeling strong emotions. But it doesn't necessarily have to mean that we are anxious or scared or angry. It can mean any of an abundant amount. I think that someone right before they step forward to the marriage altar probably has bowels that are agitated.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's right? More like that. It's a bleh, bleh. Yeah, exactly. But it's not from like a sweet entirely lovey-dovey place. Yeah.
No, it's from like this is real crap. This is real stuff going on.
Yeah.
Place.
Yeah. And I kind of would liken it to like the moment there's so in the Vatican there is a place called the crying room, right? And because sometimes splanchnizomai is a word that would get translated in the English to like crying, like Jesus wept, right? Mm-hmm. The crying room in the Vatican is the room that the newly elected Pope goes to get themselves settled down before they are presented to the world. And I would say that is the splanchnizomai room, right? Because all at once you have a feeling of, holy crap, oh my God, this is amazing. Oh, I hope I don't throw this up. Like, I hope I don't screw up. Is the robe going to fit? Why do I have to wear red shoes? I don't agree with the other people. Like, I wish we would have voted for someone else. Yay. And of course I deserve this, right? So Splunk Nitzomai is such a like, I wish we would make it like a 3-pronged, lots of comma thing rather than just one word, because it's so like bleh, bleh. And that's how I would translate it. And then Jesus, bleh.
I hear that.
But it's very different, for example, from when in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus meets the rich young ruler, the man who comes and has memorized all of the prayers and is reciting all the things in the right way. And Jesus doesn't have splunk nitzomai in this encounter. Jesus has agape love for the person. Jesus loves
That's very
them.
different.
That's very different from this, like, oh my goodness, these people are like cats in a room full of rocking chairs, right?
Yeah.
It's inheriting... It's adopting a new family, and you know that the family you're adopting is going to be hard because they've got some trauma, and you love them, and you don't like pity them. You're not mad at them. You're committed to being with them, but you know it's going to be hard, and you're taking that on. So it's real. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's my splunk nitzomai interruption of the day.
Well, no, I think it's crucial to understanding the text and understanding as you go into, the feeding of the 5,000. This is where Christ is coming from, right?
Sure.
Is this place of blah. So, I mean, I think it's worth spending some time with that and seeing what that means.
And I would also say that this is going to come out weird. So know that I'm not trying to be anti-Semitic, and I'm not trying to like make light of war in the Middle East and all of the like tensions that are there. But I think currently, given the fact that the place where this feeding of 5,000 happened just got violently destroyed, parts of it destroyed in the last couple of weeks, by people who wanted to maintain their way of faith and their orthodoxy, or their right practice. Orthodoxy literally means right practice, what they believe is the right kind of rituals to follow. And they didn't think this tradition of the feeding of the 5,000 was a part of that right way of practicing faith. They decided to destroy it. And so it's a part of that same conflict that we were talking about. Like, this is the right way, my way or the highway. And people saying, well, I kind of like the story that Annie Lamont said about cats and crying on a boat. Like, can that be a part of my faith story too? And obviously, given the fact that we're doing Bible study on a Google app, right, means that we are more heavily on the side of culture can be a part of what we were up to, but because we believe so much that prayers and faith and all of those things can center and root our lives, that no thorn can shake my inmost calm, right?
Yep.
That's a goofy reference to a hymn, with the idea that like
good hymn.
Things are solid enough that, come on, if an iPhone app is enough to dethrone God, whatever that idea we thought about God was, maybe wasn't God. And so we sometimes have to reevaluate and rethink and rewalk through and whatever the place.
Yeah.
I don't know. Can I just say that this Mark text and the way that it's kind of cut and paste is a good reminder for us that when we're telling our stories in faith communities, we don't have to tell every detail either.
I think that's a great point.
Right?
I mean, it's odd that we edit this way on Sunday service, but I mean, I think that's fair, that there's a place and a time for the different pieces of our stories to come forward.
And not every day is the day to tell the story of our PTSD, and not every day is the day to tell the story of all of our awards. And not every day is the day to tell the story of what we hunger for most but didn't get, right? And I'm not saying edit yourself and don't be your true self at church, but just pick and choose how you're participating based on when it's safe and what's happening in the world around you. And Mark particularly, Jesus, the way he trains the disciples to go out in the world, he doesn't say, I say to you, take this best lesson plan that ever existed and teach it to everyone, right? Mark is not a Jesus who has lessons plans. It's a Jesus who says, go out and listen to people.
Yeah.
Stay at their house as long as they need you, not stay at their house until they know all the right rules to follow God. And because we're in the Gospel of Mark, it's about listening. And so there's just not, it's Bible study, there's not a good time to say one of the ways that we can be faithful in a church space is not just by knowing what words in the prayers or knowing which creed is on which page of the book, but by listening and sharing stories that are appropriate for what's going on in the conversation. And some of us, sometimes I'm so excited about what's going on, I'll storm through the door and I'll say, I'm going to tell you this thing. And I'm not paying attention to what was already happening in the room before I entered it. And so to just take a moment and breathe, listen to what's going on at the coffee hour table before you say, hey, I need you to know it was my birthday and you forgot my birthday, or whatever it is, because we all have those moments where we speak before we listen. And this cropping of text, if anything, I suppose, can remind us of that.
I think you can take that lesson out if that's how you're hearing it.
I just made that up.
No, I think it's a good thing I think it's a really good thing to talk about. And I think that listening is a something that is much harder in our culture than we give it credit for anymore. That listening is really core to our faith and core to understanding how to be in our faith, and that our culture pays people to be professional listeners so that perhaps we don't always have to learn how to do that ourselves.
Wah, wah. Yeah.
It's hard.
Yeah.
It's a hard
in
skill.
all the diverse ways that we need to listen, whether it's the look that someone's giving us across the room, or the silence that we have when we speak a different language from someone else and we have to kind of listen to what's going on in the culture around us, or the literal listening. We have some people in our congregation who just declared that their hearing aids don't work and they won't work for the next 3 weeks, so no one should talk to them. And so figuring out how to listen to somebody who's just declared, don't talk to me, I can't hear you, is an interesting thing. And so we press on and we do our best, and we remember that there was never a moment in the biblical scriptures where they're like, we figured it out.
Yeah, right. Totally.
Is there more that you want to say, Amanda?
No, not necessarily. Good
That's
to see everyone. That's it.
Bible study. Hope it didn't suck. Bye.
Bye.